I have mixed feelings on this book. This is the final installment of the series, and as a finale, it's terrible. It's lacking in any sort of grandeur or spectacle. I think we all expected a really nice send-off to the series, and credit where credit is due. The last page where they unveil a bust of Wilbert Awdry in the big station is very heartwarming. But the rest of the book is so unrelated to any of that. This is the book where Gordon is famously retired from pulling the express. I love this so much, and I think it's so fitting that it happens in the final book of the series. I love how it's handled. The Fat Controller tells Gordon Pip and Emma have joined the railway, and as he talks, Gordon slowly understands what he's getting at. The words, "Gordon, I'm retiring you from the express," are never blatantly said. Gordon just understands. And as a humbled 90-year-old engine at this point, he accepts it. It's a really nice, subtle moment, and a nice bookend to Gordon's overall character journey. I also like how there is a story in this book that shows a little of what Gordon's life is like in post-retirement. That inclusion is very nice. The problem is that this should have been the plot of the whole book, leading up to the unveiling of the Awdry bust in the last story. Instead, what is an incredibly important moment in the series is shoehorned into the beginning of an unrelated story about Thomas and a frickin' swan. I'm sorry, what? And in the next story, Donald and Douglas bumping into buffers. Are you kidding me? What does this have to do with anything? Why is this unimportant, unrelated nothing story in the finale book of the series? I do love what Chris does with Gordon in this book, and that's why I rank it slightly higher than all the previous ones. We'll talk about it later once we get to it, but you can tell this lead up to Gordon's retirement was something Chris really wanted to focus on, but was probably pushed back by the publishers in favor of more Thomas-focused books. As this was the final book he'd ever be writing, he probably threw it in just so it could happen. But man, does it feel anticlimactic. Also, Clive Spong, what the hell, man? Why did you use the same illustration twice in the same story? This is just a redraw of the picture from the Fat Controller's engines. Oh my god, this is just lazy. You couldn't even be bothered to change the positions of the characters? A very unfocused and unsatisfying book. What should have been a grand finale to this 66-year-old series feels more like a minor footnote in the grand scheme of things. Number 37, Thomas and Victoria. This is a weird one, because it does have structure and an overall plot, unlike the previous ones. In this book, an old coach-turned-garden shed called Victoria gets rediscovered near Thomas's branch line. And over the course of the book, she gets restored into a working coach again. We even get a nice little flashback story to her old days when she worked on the Furness Railway with her own engine. But then the plot just stops dead, and we get some unrelated story about Daisy and eels. I'm sorry, what? What does this have to do with anything this book is about? Victoria's not even in this story. What is this? I also have to say, why is Thomas in the title of this? Thomas barely does anything in this book. He barely has any dialogue. Edward and Toby were more central characters to this, not him. I know, because marketability, but come on. If Thomas is in the title, I expect to see some Thomas focus. Random side tangent, but I think the illustrations are kind of bad in this book. Not bad as in poorly drawn, but bad as in they fail to convey what's being said in the text. Like here, this picture is meant to be Thomas hearing Victoria in the brush near the station. But we never see Victoria. This one is meant to be Thomas's driver talking to Victoria. But again, she's not shown. Or this one, in which Henrietta's balcony bends because of Toby's sudden stop. This could have easily been from a different angle that shows Toby stopping suddenly and Henry's balcony bending behind him. The direction of these illustrations is just lazy. Also, another side tangent. The story implies Victoria has been beside the station in the brush for many years. Why only now, all of a sudden, does she decide to speak up and say hello? This book takes place in like 2007. You're telling me she just sat there for 50, 60 odd years not saying anything? That's so dumb. Overall, a fairly sweet book that does feel somewhat inspired and builds the world a bit more. It doesn't feel like it was written out of obligation like the first few books on this list, but it's not great. I don't even know if I would say that this is good, to be honest. The stories, with the exception of the flashback one with Albert, are all pretty dang forgettable. #36. Wilbert the Forest Engine. The structure of this one is similar to Stepney's book. A real engine visits Sodor, and the book is about all the stuff that happened during the visit. The second story even has a flashback to give the real engine some historical context. The difference is, the Stepney stories are actually fun. This book is just boring. There's some inspired ideas in here, I'll give him that. I really like Cab Over Wheels, that's the standout definitely. And I like how Wilbert goes to other places on Sodor besides Thomas's branch. We get to see him on the Little Western too with all those guys. But, can you remember anything he does in these? Funny how in a book called Wilbert the Forest Engine, the most memorable story is the one that Wilbert doesn't do anything in. This book features a weird loose end that's never touched on again. The whole reason Wilbert comes to Sodor is because the Fat Controller wanted to trial an austerity tank engine like him. At the end of the book, he says an engine like Wilbert is exactly what he needs.
By the end of his stay, the Fat Controller knew that an engine like Wilbert was exactly what he needed.
Implying that's going to come into play later, but it's just never followed up on. That's not at the fault of this book, of course, but just a weird loose end I wanted to mention. Also, Percy's porridge. What even is this story? Percy has to go to the works because he ran over a sack of porridge? He's a 20-ton steam engine. That damaged him? Really? Wow, that's so stupid. Okay, so apparently this story was written as a creative writing exercise by some children, and the book is dedicated to them as a result. I don't actually own a physical copy of this book, so I didn't know that. The story is still dumb though. This volume has the structure for a decent book, and all the stories do relate, but it's just not very memorable. I like Wilbert and all, and I like the idea of making the real steam engine named after Wilbert Awdry himself an actual character in the series, but it's a fairly skippable book. I'd rather a book with 4 random memorable stories than a book with 4 related stories that aren't that interesting. #35. Toby, Trucks, and Trouble. I find the title of this book funny. You can tell this book was basically just Chris wanting to write another Toby-centric book, but couldn't think of a title. That's basically what this is. It's Toby the Tram Engine 2. More fun times on the branch line with Toby and the characters most relevant to him. Chris has said before Toby was his favorite character, and that really comes across here. I love how there's a whole flashback story that shows us a little of Toby's life pre-Sodor. We got a glimpse of that in his very first book, of course, but this one shows us what his brothers looked like, the harbor he worked at, and even some other engines he came across on his travels. Pretty neat. I think the main problem with this book is that there just is no theme. There is no plot, nothing connecting any of these stories. Mavis hits a lorry, random flashback story with Toby, Percy kills Bulstrode, Toby derails on the crossing. Mavis and the lorry ends implying that Percy and Toby are going to have quite the workload with Mavis gone.
I'm afraid it will mean more work for you, Percy, he said. And with that, they had to be content.
But like, not really? It doesn't really come into play again? Only thing it amounts to is Terrence helping out at Farquhar for a page, but that's really it. I also want to mention Bulstrode. He's introduced here and is weirdly still relevant in the franchise still. I think it's so interesting that Chris's biggest impact on the legacy of the Thomas franchise was this random boat character who for some reason keeps showing up in the show and merchandise. Bulstrode was ultimately the franchise's greatest takeaway from Chris's books, and I find that really funny. Chris loves Toby, and you can tell he had some fun ideas in mind for him. That inspiration shines through in this book a little bit, sort of. I think the Toby-centric stories are fun, but the other two are pretty whatever. The lack of any structure or plot makes this book rather unimportant and kinda random. A pretty skippable one in the grand scheme of things, but a fine little volume if you just want more of the Branchline gang. But don't worry, there's no shortage of supply when it comes to those. Speaking of which, number 34.